Well, welcome everybody. I'm Mark Mazower. I'm the director of the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, and it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Welcome, Ruth, who is a professor of Italian and history at NYU, but probably better known to many people as a commentator who has been featured in CNN, Sky News, Salon, Democracy Now, and many other outlets, commenting on the phenomenon of the rise of authoritarianism in the world, and on a research that has been brought together in her most recent book that was published last year by Norton, Strongmen, a study of authoritarian males from Mussolini to the present, in which she tries to pull together something like an authoritarian playbook that would help us understand how such figures muscle their way into power and then try to stay in power. And this obviously speaks to the present and to the experience that the United States has just been through, and to the experience that many other countries are either going through or have been through. But I just want to preface our conversation by drawing attention to Ruth's work as a historian that now dates back over many years, and that I've followed and admired from the very start, and from what I think was your very first book, Fascist Modernities, at any rate the first book in English, which was path-breaking, brilliant work that I think for the first time for an English audience took seriously fascist aesthetics, debates amongst fascist creative writers and intellectuals and filmmakers, and at a time when almost nobody else was doing this. And I think if I now try to see the thread that connect your early work in Italian fascism to your most recent general work on this international phenomenon, I see two things that were there at the start that you were interested in long before most people. One was aesthetics, taking seriously the aesthetics of fascism, both the idea of the kind of cultural media as ways in which you could project values, but also the debates amongst fascists themselves. And the second was gender, and we can be more specific than that, masculinity. The idea of a fascist man of virility, which was, you'd have thought was inescapable if you were talking about Mussolini's regime, but had apparently escaped most people, really until you and a few others started talking about it. So I see somehow that there are important themes for the present that you've been reflecting on for a long time now. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. Maybe we can just begin with you telling us a little bit about why you wrote this book and what it was that you wanted to say.
Sure, and thank you, Mark, and everybody at the Institute for hosting me. And it's a pleasure to speak with you. We've known each other for a long time, and I'm excited to have this dialogue. I wrote the book for a couple of reasons. One is with increasing numbers of countries in the world falling, under in periods of democratic decline, I felt it was a good time to look back over the evolution of authoritarianism over a century. So starting with Mussolini, and the book is divided into three eras: the fascist era, the military coup era, and then what I call new authoritarianism, which starts with the end of the Cold War, where people come in more through elections and then they manipulate elections to stay there. And I wanted to take on certain myths that have endured about authoritarianism, such as the fact it's reputed to be an efficient and productive form of governance. The law and order brings stability, all of these cliches. And so one of the things I show through a chapter on corruption and many other ways and violence is that how destructive and dysfunctional these states are, and how many people, how much talent and resources are lost through theft, through squander, through people going to exile, people being killed, so that kind of thing. The other reason is that we're living in a period of great historical revisionism, where people go around, around the world with T-shirts that say Pinochet did nothing wrong. When I teach my class on World War II, in which we read your work, when we do the Nazi-Soviet pact, I have to tell my class that if we were living in Putin's Russia, I could go to jail for teaching this. It's now, you cannot mention this anymore. So for that reason too, I wanted to really record what was going on in these states in the past, and how they manufactured these myths, like the trains run on time, or that Putin's a great patriot. And then finally, as an American, I was very affected by the rise of Trump, and started writing about him in 2015. As soon as I saw him doing his rallies with his loyalty oaths and start his disinformation, I had a sense of dread, and it was very familiar to me for the reasons that you set out for my studies of the past. So it all came together in this book.
Maybe I can ask you to share some thoughts about the moment that we're living in, because near the beginning of the book, you say something along the lines of, ours is the age of the strong man. And we can look at Putin, we can look at Bolsonaro, Trump as was. It appears to be an age in which democracy is fragile and being betrayed in places. But it was Michael Oakeshott, I think, the British conservative critic in the late 1930s, who said the classic weakness of the liberal is to fixate on the person of the dictator, by which he meant, I think, that the dictator can be a kind of alibi. If you think that democracy is the natural order of things, then there is something to be explained. But if you or I look back over 2 centuries of history, actually democracy is absolutely not the natural order of things. And if we look at a Gaddafi figure, Gaddafi coming into Libya, a country that at that point had been a kingdom for 11 years, of which 10 had been already parliamentary parties had been abolished, is a very different proposition, never mind their personality differences, from Trump coming into America. And so there is, I think, a question, an interesting question about what the limits are of focusing on a series of individuals for you. I mean, it's clearly a choice that you made.
Yeah, well, I would say that although I focus on individuals, I also focus on their enablers. And the core of the book is, so I kind of individuate this authoritarian playbook. And these are the tools of rule that have marked authoritarians over a century. And it's corruption, violence, the myth of national greatness, propaganda, and virility or machismo. Mm-hmm. And so through this, and each one goes over a century, which made it much harder to write. It would have been easier to do it through people, biographically, which is how some other books are arranged. So you have everything Mussolini, but precisely because I didn't want to, it's not all about individuals. It's about processes of collaboration, corruption, and how they fall from power, right. how they get complicity from people, how they get people to believe what they say. And so it's about enabling. And so it's not just about the leader, it's about the meeting of the leader and elites and the people.
Yes.
And in that triangle is produced the alchemy that leads nations to embrace this form of government. And the other thing I want to do is to show what are the historical moments, what are the patterns in which this kind of individual is embraced and brought in by elites, because I make it very clear they're nothing on their own. They have to They have to have elites to bring them in the system, unless they're, and even when in the case of a military coup, they have to have enough support or they don't attempt it, actually. And so it's trying to look at, you know, the conditions in societies over and over. And I'm very, as a historian, very attentive to keep these three periods of fascism, military coup, and 21st century separate in some ways. And yet what the book shows is that many of these patterns recur. And one of the main ones is when a society has gone through intense social progress, could be secularization, could be racial emancipation, could be workers' rights, you know, gender emancipation. Some people are overjoyed and others become angry and anxious, and they're worried about demographic change that goes with the race. And this is when these figures are elevated and accepted by elites who bring them in to the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. So they emerge after periods of progress in some way.
They very much do. And they are a shock to the system in that they are reactionaries. They're going to turn back the clock on certain, like, for example, racial progress, the way that Trump wanted to undo everything that Obama did, or Pinochet wanted to undo everything that Allende had done. But they also mix things up. They operate through shock events, and they mobilize people. We know this from our studies of fascism. They mobilize people in new ways. They communicate in new ways. So when Mussolini, in like 1922, I think, he defined fascism as a revolution of reaction. This contradiction and this tension actually is proper to almost all strongmen, no matter how they come to power. You
see, well, I can see in some cases that I can see the force of the argument in some cases that there's a period in which democracy has brought change to people, and some people have adopted that and other people have reacted, and therefore you see the strongman coming in as a kind of reactive phenomenon. But it seems to me other cases that you talk about, it would be harder to fit that model to them. I don't know that you would talk about Libya or Nasser in Egypt. It's not, but that you would talk about such figures as coming in. In the case of Trump, you can see how there is a kind of culture war going on. So the thrust of Oakeshott's criticism, I take to be that your way of putting it suggests that more democratic periods bring changes that, you know, we should embrace, but some people don't. I'm being very crass about it. And that in those tensions you get the threat of an authoritarian personality. But that's a very, essentially, that's a view that says that democracy is sort of doing what it should. It's not bringing everyone along, but it's doing what, but Oakeshott was saying, I think, that there may be times in which the regime out of which a dictator emerges was malfunctioning. And maybe the democracy was malfunctioning, or at least many people thought the democracy was malfunctioning. And so the rise of the dictator has to be analyzed, and of an authoritarian regime has to be analyzed differently as a symptom of problems in democracy.
In some cases, that's true. And we know, for example, in Weimar Germany, there was already a recourse to executive orders and dysfunctions of that sort, which is why the conservative elites invited in Hitler, and then he, you know. And then the other thing is in Chile. It's very interesting. In Chile, the years before the coup, which the narrative we hear most about, for some very good reasons, is the CIA involvement in creating, in crippling Allende's socialist government through economic measures, psychological warfare, etc. But there was also a kind of impasse that had been reached between the Christian Democrats and conservatives and Allende's government, so that he had to make recourse. There was like yeah, an impasse. So he had to make recourse to executive orders more and more to govern. And there was even talk of impeaching him.
Mhm.
So that governance, even without the CIA pushing things to a crisis point, disrupting the food chain and all of that, there was at the elite level a sense that this wasn't working. And governance was impeded. And you can also say that was the case somewhat with the end of Obama, when the Republicans also did obstructionism, and then Obama had to make recourse to executive orders. So these are moments in which more and more people feel disaffected, and there is something not working in the governance process. And I make this clear that's the whole first part of the book is how they rise. And it's divided into the 3 periods. But I wanted to do justice to this precisely because of this point.
Right.
If you don't understand all of the tensions that existed in society, in the processes of governance, as well as at the social, the kind of grassroots level, you can't understand why they had such success.
Yes, absolutely. I want to come on to some of the specifics in a minute, but I just want to finish with this. You see, suppose somebody says to you, the truth of the matter is that just democracy is not the natural order of things. It's just unbelievably fragile. There have been strong men dating back to the beginning of mass representative politics. They've been with us since the early 19th century. They're always going to be with us. We shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't look for commonalities. They're just part of the political landscape. The only reason why we are discussing things in these terms is there was a period of about 10 years after the end of the Cold War where we all thought for a moment that democracy was the new normal and going to spread around the world. And so that in a sense, part of what we're having to deal with are our own dashed expectations. Is that a useful way of looking at things? Or is that just too cynical? I mean, is that how you look at things, or?
No.
Okay, how do you?
No, and it's all the more reason, to to bust these myths that the proper alternative is, quote, law and order, authoritarian governance, because, and I really do go out of my way to highlight things that are, for example, are not enough known. Like I myself had to triple check, even though it was from a super reputable, analyst, the fact that Putin has jailed tens of thousands of businessmen because he's a predator, right? And business, and Erdogan has seized more than $32 billion worth of business and assets, real estate, schools, businesses. These are predators, and we know that we may be familiar with the examples under fascism when Jews and other targets of the state, and of course how it evolved. You've written about this, and the Nazi war machine, or the plunder machine. But we don't hear enough about how the people ruling today are plunder machines. And so this is profoundly important if we want to, again, dispute this idea that the alternative to democracy is some kind of capitalist authoritarianism. And this is what China is trying to get us to accept.
Yes.
And that's why so one of the themes of the book is plunder, how these individuals amass a lot of power even within democracies, and they are individuals highly not only they're kind of hoarders. I don't say that in the book. They want our attention 24/7. They want to channel national resources. They want to plunder bodies. And so for Berlusconi and Trump, Trump was mostly before he came to office, but Mussolini and Gaddafi it was as though Jeffrey Epstein was the head of state, and was able to use the resources of the state to kind of plunder bodies and have a pipeline of female and Gaddafi males as well. So these are profoundly destructive individuals. And I felt that right now, where more and more people are disaffected with democracy and perhaps making arguments that to me indeed are cynical, like the one you raised, we need to have a very clear record of what the alternative is.
So it's interesting because I don't see this as a question, as a cynical matter to say that democracy is fragile, but I'm interested in an approach that is looking at the problems of dictatorship. I mean, the phenomenon of the businessman turned demagogue is an interesting modern phenomenon. And you illuminate it, I think, very revealingly. I suppose the counterfactual in my mind is, suppose we had a dictator who wasn't a sexual predator, wasn't particularly obsessed with a cult of personality, was in fact quite incorruptible. Would that make him any better? In other words, where is Salazar is as close as you might get to a man who was not, I think he was reasonably personally modest and austere and a devout Catholic. Not that I want to, this is not me approving of dictatorship at all. I still think dictatorship is horrible. I'm just wondering whether the arguments, there's a whole different categories of arguments. There's arguments from morality. There are arguments from economic efficiency. And then there are political ideological arguments as well. And it seems to me that your approach uses all three. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, but well, Francisco Franco also, he wasn't a sexual predator. And in fact, I say that he stayed in power longer because he had a far less destructive lifestyle than the fascists, certainly, and he wasn't as interested in major territorial expansion. But he's still, and the other thing is, we don't, for example, many people also wouldn't think of him as particularly corrupt, but the evidence of corruption in the state, the research has been slow to come out precisely because of the difficulty of accessing archives. Even in fascist Italy, believe it or not, the first serious studies of corruption in the fascist party, they're only coming out now. The first books to kind of collected essays of academics about corruption are coming out now. And this is because of the efficacy of censorship, of threat, and all of these authoritarian tools. So even if they don't tick all the boxes, they don't all have to be sexual predators, but they still merit, they still merit revisionism because they killed many people or threatened many people, and were not indeed good for the country in the end.
Mm-hmm. Can we say something about virility and masculinity, which is a theme that runs through the book, and where you highlight, there are these notorious newsreels and photos of Mussolini bare-chested, helping in the Battle of the Grain and so on, and you fast forward from that to Putin, and you see a common theme. Would you tell us a little bit about the importance of that?
So the term strongmen, which many people use, but I am using it here to refer to a subset of authoritarians who not only use the rest of the playbook, the corruption, violence, etc., but they also use machismo as an element of political legitimacy. And so I wanted to take seriously when Putin, it's easy to laugh at Mussolini or Putin taking off their shirts, but let's take the example of Putin. This kind of hyper-masculinity is dosed out very carefully. And the more that he feels his control is slipping, the more he increases it. So it's it's very much a strategy that is integrated and enables the other tools of rule. So for example, the strongman is somebody who's a man of the people, but he's also a man above all other men. He's a kind of superman, and he's often given a kind of religious benediction. He's there by the will of the people, but he's also somehow connected to divine, to divine mandate. And you have this runs throughout history. And it's often, of course, the most profane and violent individuals who are accorded this honor by religious institutions. So that's an example where it's not just about the individual, it's about the societal important institutions of society that are enabling him. Mm-hmm. But the virile man who stands above all other men is also the man who gets away with it. Mm-hmm. He can get away with things that lesser beings cannot. And so this virility is at the core of the lawlessness, because what is authoritarianism? It is a legitimation of lawlessness. It is the conversion of the rule of law into lawlessness. And at its most perfect, it's not only genocidal, perfect in the perverse strongman way, not only genocidal, but also kleptocratic. Mm-hmm. And again, here we come back to the plunder. So the machismo is not just about representations and newsreels, although that's very, very key in keeping the cult of personality going. But it connects very concretely to configurations of power that get replicated in state institutions, that set the tone for policies. And when we see how democracies start to slide through corruption, through restaffing, look what's happened to our civil service, what happened under Trump. Where ethics violations and lawlessness and sexual harassers, if you hire so many sexual harassers and assaulters, as Trump did, you set the tone. And Trump also partly decriminalized domestic violence. So there's many, many things we haven't even taken in the scope of what he did. But so it's all connected to this kind of machismo. So I wanted to center that. And I also felt I perused, the source space for this book is memoirs, it's, media representation, but also databases and a lot of political science literature on authoritarianism. And I found that this was missing. And as you said in the introduction, I've been working on masculinity and configurations of male power for a long time. And I felt this was something that I could add to the mix.
So maybe this is a moment to turn the conversation to Trump, if that's okay with you. I'm thinking about what Trump and Trump's masculinity tells us about the United States. I mean, if I make the comparison in my mind with another politician who I don't really admire, Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson had a fairly checkered love life, some of which hit the newspapers fairly recently. It didn't appear to do him any harm, but I wouldn't have said that it had much, you couldn't explain such popularity as he had by reference to it either. It wasn't a plus for him. Trump seems to be a different case. There seems to be something in Trump's projection of his masculinity that was positively appealing to some people, but that's just my own amateurish view. Where does your analysis of masculinity take us if we try to use it to think about not the strong man himself, but the people who admire him?
Well, it starts at the very beginning. And so just as in the fascist years where people, you had Hitler and Mussolini kind of campaigning in various ways, Hitler for much longer, and the new authoritarian age where you have people like Duterte, consciously using their masculinity, connecting it to violence, the capacity to do personal violence and get away with it. This is very important in forming their persona of the maverick, the rogue, the person who's going to is going to bring law and order. And only they can do it. When Trump said, only I can fix it. I am your voice. He also told he's going to think for people, act for people. And this was highly appealing. Now, in Trump's case, just like with Berlusconi, he came from out, he already had a past as the man who could have it all, the man who could get away with it all. And so he's not an anomaly because you had Berlusconi, but he made it very clear and when he was on the campaign trail to do things that no Democrat with a small d would ever do, but authoritarians do all the time. So when he said, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and I wouldn't lose any followers, this was him boasting about the loyalty of that he would have, but he was also saying very clearly that he was going he considered himself above the law and that he would continue to be the man who gets away with it. And this was very admired. This was a breath of fresh air. Now, of course, those followers had already been primed by years of conservative talk radio, by years of Republican lawlessness, and that increased during the campaign. You had, you had Republican officials like Greg Gianforte, punching journalists. You had a Texas Governor Greg Abbott joking about shooting journalists in 2000. This was in 2017. So this culture of lawlessness, Trump channeled that very well in his masculine presentation. And because one of the maxims of the strongmen is that they're superb actors. Many of them come to power with a past in mass communications. Like Mobutu was a journalist as well as Mussolini. And they will be whatever you need them to be. They will say whatever you need them to say. And this is also why they cobble together these constituencies of, like gangsters and housewives and priests or, imams, as well as the most criminal elements of society, right? And all of this, the machismo, as the man who gets away with it, but yet will also bring order. This mix of law and order and the leader who will enable you to be as lawless by telling you there aren't any limits. This is intoxicating for many people.
But my question was about why some people find it intoxicating to have a virile leader and other people couldn't care less. What is it that we know? What is it that we've learned about America, to focus on that case, that we didn't know perhaps, that would help us understand the appeal of Trump's virility?
Well, these individuals, we'll stick to Trump, embodied the kind of supposedly self-made man, the glamour, that is very much part of American culture and has always been lionized in American culture. That you're this, in fact, we know, of course, he's not self-made, but this was the image. And also our own particular, America has always been world famous as a producer of mass culture, from the golden age of Hollywood and somebody who came with a background in television, who was a TV star. This was very appealing to people. And so one of the things that we've seen, and I'm writing an op-ed about this, is that what happened in Berlusconi's Italy too, before this, that the values of spectacle, the values of media popularity become a measure of what is admired in politics. And that is profoundly American, but it's not unique to America. But this has been a very marked change. And Trump, so Trump kind of accelerated things that were already going on in America, from voter suppression to legitimizing extremism, to the lawless man, and also the authoritarian drift of the GOP. And the reason I mentioned somebody like Greg Gianforte punching a journalist is this is also an exhibition of machismo. And or think of Mike Pompeo, because the system populates with what used to be called little Mussolinis or little Hitlers. And all of them exhibit this toxic machismo. So when Mike Pompeo engaged in innumerable ethics violations as head of State Department, and called it swagger. He tweeted repeatedly that this is called swagger. That's machismo.
I suppose I want to turn in a minute to the question of coups, and maybe I should have said at the beginning to our audience that we'll have question and answer shortly, and you're very welcome to put up your questions on the chat, on the Q&A. But just sticking with this for a moment, I guess what I'm getting at is how your analysis helps us identify certain features of specific countries that have succumbed to a strongman that may outlive the strongman. I mean, give you an example of what I mean. I'm always very struck when I go and catch an internal flight in the United States that priority is given to active servicemen and their families. That's not a category that is singled out in any other country I normally fly in. It speaks to me to a certain unquestioning cultural prestige around the military that is surely connected to the immense investment that this country puts into its military and its active use of those military. And with all of this militarization of politics, one could see a connection, possibly not, to the culture of virility you're talking about. So this is where I'm wondering how your analysis helps us explain not only how these people come to power, what their defects are, but what it was about a particular country in which they came to power that may linger after them.
Yeah, I mean, if we keep to America, clearly the personality cult, which draws on celebrity culture, is key. And again, that's why I mentioned this is a feature of America. It's hard for me. I know what you want me to be talking about, also American exceptionalism in a way, but these
not particularly. But I'm interested in how the specific analysis in particular countries tells us about what it tells us about those countries.
Yeah, well, one of the things it tells us is no country is immune to this. But in the case of Trump, our fascination with celebrity, our fascination with the cowboy, because the narratives that these men spin, and Trump's a very good storyteller, he's a highly skilled propagandist, was always a kind of Western. And, when he said I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, it was very important. Fifth Avenue is his turf. That's where the headquarters of Trump International is. So the best of them are able to layer their stories onto existing archetypes and existing narratives and celebrity cultures typical of that country. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I mentioned this impoverishment of politics and replacement with spectacle. Mm-hmm. And that is something that happens everywhere, the personalization of politics. People complain about it, even with Macron, of course. But when it's united to the corruption, to the violence, to the extremism, then it becomes the strongman phenomenon, and it is part of taking a country toward authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm. Can we turn to the January the 6th? We were chatting when we spoke last time a little bit about a coup and when a coup is a coup and when it's not a coup. How did you interpret those events, and what were you thinking when you watched them?
Well, first of all, I had already written. I had to turn in this book in the summer, and so of course I didn't even know how the election would go. But I had forecast that he wasn't going to go from office quietly. And then I had also been writing op-eds saying that some kind of shock, I call them shock events, some kind of violent act could occur. And so I saw this as the culmination of everything that Trumpism represented, from the very careful signaling to and cultivation of extremists, of anti-government activists, of subversives. Also let's not forget, he's surrounded by people like Roger Stone, a highly dangerous individual with decades of experience in propping up authoritarians, including those who came to power by coup, like Mobutu. Stone worked for with Manafort. So January 6th was a self-coup, technically. It was designed to disrupt the certification process and get Trump in power. But we have to look very carefully at the whole window of this. It was like I believe it was like a state of exception that was opened the moment that the election happened and Trump wouldn't accept the results. A state of exception was open. And the things he tried actually channel all of the history of authoritarianism. From he kind of explored having a military option with the regular armed forces. And that's why the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, came out with that out of the blue declaration that, oh, the armed forces are not going to obey an individual, but only the Constitution. So that was gone. The other thing he did is typical of how authoritarianism works in Turkey and Russia today, which is the, election results that don't go your way become something to be, litigated, they become something to be denied and replaced with the fabrication that suits your need to stay in office. And the reason it's important to look at all these things is this is the way that the GOP, which I see as a far right party, is going to normalize this that will be how they do business, refusing at the state level to also seat the electors. All of this machinations. Trump gave a presidential imprimatur. The last thing was the violent assault, which very much reminds us of early fascism, and Trump's personality cult and his victimhood cult, which is typical of every strongman in my book, whether it's Gaddafi or Pinochet. They all have the victim cult, the persecution complex. So January 6th was a rescue operation of the faithful who are inside the institutions, right? They're military, they're policemen, as well as people with animal costumes, to rescue the leader and keep him there. So it's very profound, and it's also a trial run. Several of the people there said, well, on our next trip, we will do better. So this is a profound strike at our democracy. And the fact that he was not impeached over it is giving license to all of his supporters in and out of state institutions to try again.
So what are we to make of the fact that it failed?
It failed to keep him in office, but it was a great success in other ways, because it showed, because if you look at it from the point of view of coups succeed if you have recruited enough people to be able to have what's called also dereliction of duty or non-action, stand downs of the personnel you would need to fight off the coup. And we know that all that happened. And, Department of Defense memos have come out. And this is also why Trump did his desperation time of hiring and firing, because people were like, well, if he's leaving office, why does he keep hiring and firing so many people? Why is he pardoning so many people, right? And of course, people like Flynn were pardoned so that they could call for martial law, and Flynn was very intimately involved in this. So although it did not work to keep Trump in office, it was a success as a trial run, and it was a success to show how undefended we are and how unprepared we are. And this has always been the problem. It's another reason I wrote the book. We have taken democracy for granted. Now, many people of color never take it for granted in terms of voting rights or the right to not be beaten up and profiled and maybe killed when you step outside. But at the level of having a democracy, we've been able to take it for granted in a way other countries don't. And this siege, the fact that even Mike Pence, who was pursued by people who wanted to hang him, but is remaining mute and silent in his complicity, is very sad and is sending a message that you can get away with this.
So thank you very much, Ruth. We've got some questions. Can I try one or two out on you, please?
Absolutely.
Okay. So this is a question which sort of follows, I think, from what we've just been talking about from Michael Hillman, and I'll just read it out to you. The 1992 US presidential election enraged the right who seem to think they were destined to rule for much, much longer. Every election cycle since then, right-wing anger arguably has only increased, whether they win or lose. How can this fever be broken? Or are we doomed to an eventual right-wing dictatorship?
Yes, that's good to go back to the 90s because all of the politics of grievance, the media of outrage, all of this started a long time ago, of course. It's very difficult. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what to answer totally because as you know, we have these two huge parties, and many Americans, some of whom are kind of provincial, would turn up their nose at other countries with so many parties, saying, oh, that's so crazy, it's so unstable, how can we keep track of all these parties? But what happens when you only have two parties and one of them becomes a far right party, which does not recognize mutual tolerance, believes that opponents should be locked up, quote. This is a huge problem, and refuses to be playing the democratic bipartisan game anymore. So that is our big problem, and I think that attacking disinformation, countering disinformation is absolutely key, because they will only stay in office if people will vote them in. So, and there are still a lot of people who never voted, even in this election. So that's one issue. But how to turn back the authoritarian political culture of the GOP, which has been years in the making, I don't have a quick answer for that.
Thank you. Maybe I can ask you a question about this work of yours compared with earlier work. Well, not compared with earlier work, but in relationship to earlier work. I mean, you trained as a historian of Italy, steeped in the history of 19th and 20th century Europe. And in this book, you write about Bolsonaro, you write about Mobutu, you write about a number of key figures in the rest of the world, from South America, from the former from colonies in Africa, and so on. What was that like for you to extend the range of your research? That's one question. Another question is whether there's a certain set of conceptual tools at your disposal honed on the debate about a European phenomenon, interwar fascism, which you then brought to bear on different periods and different parts of the world. And what had to be, how useful was that, and what had to be adjusted in that?
Those are great questions. It was refreshing to get away from writing about Italy, although one of the things I hope the reader comes away with, because Italy gets left out all too often from narratives that it should be in. Even the fact that people think Hitler was always the master of Mussolini, when indeed Mussolini taught Hitler many things, and Hitler was besotted with Mussolini for a whole decade. But Italy's also been a laboratory, both with Mussolini and again under Berlusconi. And Berlusconi is a very important template for Trump in many ways. But it was refreshing and I've also done a lot of work on empire. So I have the kind of the strongmen of decolonization of Mobutu and Gaddafi, and to look at how certain processes actually though span the use personality cults, for example. The canons of personality cults function in the same way wherever they form. Now there's regional example, there's cultural difference in terms of the representation. But so that was very interesting to respect the differences, but also find the commonalities, the big processes. such as I was saying at the beginning, the sense of in Chile that there was governance was at an impasse, or for example, that the tragedy of elites believing that they could tame the strongmen, that they bring the extremist into power and then they could tame him. And we know very well the stories of Italians and Germans finding out that instead they weren't able to tame Hitler. Mm-hmm. But even when there's a coup in Chile, there was a Christian Democrat, he'd been a former president, Eduardo Frei Montalva. And after the coup, he believed that the junta would restore order and then return governance to them to be democratic. And of course, this was wrong. And when Montalva started to speak out against the junta, he was poisoned. And it's just come out recently after years of being buried that he was poisoned. So even when there's a coup, the conservative elite enabling and the hope that the strongman will be someone other than who he is, the denial, the human, the psychological processes, those, it was very interesting to have these very different cases from regions I hadn't studied before and see the commonalities.
Right. Let me turn to another question that we have. It goes as follows. Can you thread, I guess this is a question of American celebrity, the behavior of Ted Cruz today, not nimble to the little Mussolini characterization?
So the behavior of Ted Cruz today going to Cancun, I assume that's what you mean. So for people not up on all things Ted Cruz, there's this huge human natural disaster emergency in Texas, right? People are freezing to death. There's no power, there's no water. And Senator of Texas, Ted Cruz, decided to go on vacation to Cancun. And he flew commercial. Everybody saw him there. He wasn't hiding. He was in the airport lounge. So the way I see this is Ted Cruz has always been who he is, but the influence of having somebody in power like Trump, and Cruz is such a faithful servant of Trump that even though Trump insulted his wife in a very rude fashion, he still, that didn't deter him from, so in these are authoritarian party dynamics that you see. So Cruz, again, the lesson of authoritarianism is that you can get away with it. And if you see others getting away with it, you no longer care if people see you. So he's going to go to Cancun and be in the airport with his wheelie, not caring that his constituents are dying. It seems the perfect moment to go to Cancun and not have remorse, to just sit there in the airport and sit there. And so people, his one concession is that he wore a mask this time. But this is the toll of, he's like the little dictator, the little Trump. And they feel what's the word, protected. And this is very sad for accountability, which is a bedrock of democracy. They feel they're not accountable anymore.
We have a question about India and Modi from somebody who says, how do you see Modi in India in the context of authoritarians? I'm Indian, and every Indian except one in Canada loves Modi and are shocked that I compare him to Trump.
Yes, I'm sure, because whenever I say anything about Modi, I get many irate messages from people. Modi's Modi, he's not that much in my book, but he's very important in demonstrating this maxim, this principle of authoritarianism that which builds on what I was saying before about them being very skilled in mass communication and very skilled in celebrity culture, which they use to market themselves. And the more skilled they are at this highly artificial mediatized politics, the more they seem authentic to people. and the more they have the personal bond with the followers, and having a personal bond using whatever media is the media of the day to forge that bond is key. And Modi has done this through Instagram. And he has Instagrammed his life to in a highly appealing for his followers fashion. And this makes him seem transparent. And Bolsonaro is very skilled at doing this too. So there's a kind of politics of faux disclosure that these men pull off. And I have a sentence in the book that people believe them, like when people say, why are they're such liars? Why do people believe them? They believe them because they believe in them. And they believe in them because they do such a good job of seeming to be there, omnipotent, omnipresent. And Modi also uses holograms so he can appear at rallies. And the other way Modi's highly interesting, and a lot of the book is about exile too. We haven't touched on that, and I never get asked about it. But the pain, maybe because I'm a child of immigrants and grew up in California with the closest relative a 13-hour plane ride away. I wrote about the pain of exile, and that these nations, both you have a nation of exiles who are forced to leave when you have authoritarians, but how effective authoritarians like Modi are at appealing to the diaspora. And this was true of Mussolini. And so Modi is very skilled at using diasporic politics. And so was Duterte when he was first elected. Filipinos abroad did a lot to help him get elected. So Modi exemplifies these processes of identification, of belonging, as well as, of course, what he's doing with his internal politics, his repressive internal politics.
Can I pick up on that? You know, there's this wonderful analysis in that brilliant book by Victor Klemperer, The Language of the Third Reich, which I always think is one of the greatest books ever on all of this. And he has a page or two on the phrase, I believe in him, which he noticed people saying in Germany in the early 30s. So I believe in him. You said they believe in the leader. The question is why? And one way of answering that is the answer that you've just given us, which is that these guys are particularly good at manipulating the media to present a certain image. But I wonder if there's not more to it than that. After all, the only reason that we know they're so good at it is that then
yes.
The proof is people say, I believe in him. But why? There have been other efforts in other directions. There were the efforts in social psychology that produced books like The Authoritarian Personality, which are now held in low esteem, which are interested not in the mastermind manipulating the media, but are interested in the people who say, I believe in him. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts about those people? Who believe in him?
So not only they have this media facility, but they're like sponges, these men, and they're able to make themselves the seeming vessel of deliverer of what is most wanted in a culture. And I added this chapter, the myth of the national greatness. It's called A Greater Nation, because I wanted to analyze these processes. So for example, the Strongmen promises a kind of utopia, that the nation will attain greater prosperity. It will attain greater respect. And so everybody from Mussolini up to Putin talks about how the nation's been humiliated by foreigners. It's threatened by foreign ways of life, and I will fix it, right? Through hyper-nationalism, etc. But they also channel nostalgia. This is very important because it's never just make the nation great. It's make the nation great again. So Mussolini had the Roman Empire. He had something perhaps the most solid to grab onto. Erdogan's talking constantly about the Ottoman Empire, right? And Trump has been able to kind of channel this vague time in the past when people of color knew their place and women knew their place. Bolsonaro goes back to the military dictatorship. But this seeming to be able to deliver what people feel is lacking is really key, as well as buy-offs to cronies, right? And very practical authoritarian bargains, as they're known, of course. But you're talking about the mass level. This is very important. And that's it's fascinating that these processes are fairly universal. The utopia mixed with the nostalgia, no matter where they are, they end up with the same rhetoric.
So I think that we're approaching the end of our conversations, and I just wanted to ask you one question in conclusion, which is about your outlook. The book, and to a certain extent the conversation, suggest in me an anxiety that you have, that people may still think dictatorships are effective, that they bring law and order, that they promise, that people can be seduced by the myth of dictatorship. And that suggests an anxiety about the continued allure of dictatorship, and therefore about people around us today, that their moorings can slip quite easily. How is that true? How do you feel that that's a worry? And do you think that a book like yours, or books in general, are really going to do very much to change that, if that's true?
I do feel that, and I feel that democracies have not done a good enough job of advocating vigorously, also through interesting graphic and visual identities. I mean, in France, you have Marianne. We have the Statue of Liberty. But we've been a bit lax and taking for granted the fact that we need to advocate. We have to show our heroes. We have to. It's very interesting for the media to focus on villains, but the heroes are very important to incentivize people to defend democracy, to show both people who lost their lives for democracy in the past, but people who are struggling today. So I put all of that in the conclusion. As for what books can achieve, so one of the things I've done since 2016 in particular, is probably half my time is doing media work. And I've written probably 80 op-eds. I've given over 150 interviews, could be closer to 200 now. And what I wanted to do with this was kind of a civic education, precisely because not everybody's going to buy my book, right? To educate also journalists, and I don't say this with any condescension, in particular journalists in America who only had a democratic frame. We haven't had a dictatorship or foreign occupation. So it's quite different when I talk to foreign journalists. There's a kind of shorthand. But I wanted to engage in this kind of education. So for example, at the beginning, nobody wanted to use the word authoritarian. It was just a few of us talking about it, and people they would stumble upon it, trying to say it. And then I remember the first time it appeared on CNN in a banner. And I thought, okay, and it's a collective effort. There's, Tim Snyder, many people doing this work. But that kind of getting these ideas and these concepts understood, that they can happen in America as well, that they can be valid, like a personality cult. When you say personality cult in 2017, people thought, well, that makes no sense. That's North Korea, that's Hitler. But indeed, so I've been trying to kind of educate, which is something I felt I could do. And I've also been experimenting with modes of communication. I've been doing these 2-minute videos on Twitter, and to distill these quite complex ideas into 2 minutes. So that's just what my path I've chosen to do, because I do feel we're in a bit of an emergency politically, an ongoing emergency.
Well, Ruth, I really appreciate the time that you've taken today to talk to us. And it's wonderful to have a conversation with a historian such as yourself, who can speak to the present so forcefully and so interestingly. So thank you very much for that. And to those people who've been with us, if you have 2 minutes, you should turn to Ruth's Twitter account to see more of what she has to say. And if you have longer, you should obviously read the book. And if you have longer still, I really think you should read Fascist Modernities, which is one of the great recent books on Italian fascism, which has lots to say about the present as well. Thank you everybody for joining us. Ruth, it's a pleasure to see you again, and good luck with your future work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Bye.